with strings attached. It's amazing how many things in life come with strings attached. Gifts or favors that on the surface seem to be generously given, but when you dig a bit deeper, you start to see that certain terms and conditions do indeed apply. Sometimes it's as harmless as, if I send you a Christmas card, I'd better get one in return, because if not, you are off the list. Or it might be a very generous gift to the symphony. I'm happy to make it, but we will hear Mahler's Ninth this season, won't we? And of course, families are famous for giving gifts with strings attached. I'll pay your tuition, but don't even think about majoring in poetry. So often we find ourselves on the receiving end of gifts with strings attached. Acts of generosity that come with a hidden financial or emotional quid pro quo. And if we're honest, we also know what it's like to give that kind of gift, the one that expects something in return, be it recognition or gratitude. Because deep down, we like to keep a little control. We like to tug just a bit on those strings, just to make sure our gift is adequately appreciated. But that's not how God operates. Which brings us to the story of Jesus walking along the road to Jerusalem and encountering 10 lepers crying out for mercy. Jesus hails the 10 lepers with no strings attached, no conditions, no expectations, yet only one returns to offer his thanks. And this is important because where grace meets gratitude, transformation begins. Now, to be clear, Jesus didn't heal these lepers because he wanted to be thanked. The power of the gospel isn't about learning good manners. Jesus wasn't expecting a handwritten thank you note. Be honest, sometimes you expect a handwritten thank you note. This healing, this outward and visible sign of God's grace, truly was offered with no strings attached. But in order to fully understand the impact of this story, we first have to understand leprosy, and then we have to talk about what it meant to be a Samaritan. Leprosy, or a leper, and I'm not going to get into the dermatological ramifications of this here, but a leper was someone with such a serious skin disease that it kept them apart from the community. Partly because it may have been contagious. There was no CDC in the biblical world. But from a religious perspective, there was no one more ritually impure than a leper. In fact, the only thing more ritually impure than a leper was a corpse. And lepers were seen as, in effect, the walking dead. They were as close to a corpse as one could possibly be without actually being a zombie. Because nothing was as defiling as death, and nothing was as close to death as leprosy. And so these 10 men lived together in isolation, outside the village, outside the community, on the outskirts of hope. And then there's the Samaritan part. If being a leper placed you outside the community, being a Samaritan put you outside the bounds of faith. To the Jewish community, this man was the ultimate other, a social and religious outcast, So if there was ever someone who shouldn't be the hero of a biblical story, it's this defiled, half-dead pariah. And yet, in one of those classic gospel reversals, he's the only one who returns to Jesus and praises God because his life has been utterly transformed. So often, Jesus tells stories about unexpected bearers of grace. People who don't wield authority or status or pedigree. People who don't stand at the center of society, but the overlooked, the forgotten, the reviled, the least, the lost, the lonely, the foreigner, the sinner, the powerless. And so we hear parables about good Samaritans and righteous tax collectors and prodigal sons, about women at wells and thieves on crosses and young children coming to Jesus. To society's privileged elite, these unexpected bearers of God's grace must seem like the island of misfit toys, or that bar scene in Star Wars. You know, that dimly lit cantina from the original movie, right? Filled with oddballs and outcasts, place humming with that wild music and shady characters. That's who Jesus goes to and holds up as the surprising bearers of God's grace. The ones through whom God's compassion and mercy breaks into the world in surprising, scandalous, and utterly unexpected ways. And no matter what your societal status may be, no matter what pedigree you bear, we all hold the possibility of being unexpected bearers of God's grace. Because whatever outward image we so desperately seek to project to the world, we are all, in our own ways, broken vessels in need of healing. When we open up ourselves to Jesus Christ and allow him in, we too become unexpected bearers of grace. Because that's how grace works. It shows up where it's least expected, in the people who expect it least. Grace has no terms, no conditions, no strings attached, and that is the unexpected miracle of faith in Jesus Christ. And the only possible response to God's grace, as demonstrated by the one known to us as the grateful Samaritan, is gratitude, which from an etymological perspective makes perfect sense, because grace and gratitude share the same Latin root, which means that linguistically and spiritually, grace and gratitude are inextricably linked. Grace is the gift. Gratitude is the response. When the world says, I did this on my own, grace says, God did this for me. And so Jesus holds up this man, this triple threat of otherness in the ancient world, a leper, a foreigner, a Samaritan, as an unexpected bearer of grace. Not because he had good social graces, but because he was overwhelmed with gratitude for God's grace. And before our very eyes, we see this transition from grace to gratitude to transformation. And that is what is freely offered to each one of us every single day. When we return to Jesus, when we offer gratitude in response to God's grace, we are indelibly changed. Again, the good news is that God's grace doesn't come with strings attached. And that's so hard for us to comprehend because so rarely is that the case with human interactions. There's no such thing as a free lunch, we like to say. And yet God doesn't say, I'll love you if you go to church every Sunday, if you join a committee or teach Sunday school, if you give generously. Now these things may well and often do draw you into deeper relationship with God. But there are no rules or requirements or admission fees to access God's grace. God's grace doesn't exist behind a paywall. It is freely offered. No strings attached. And for that, like the grateful Samaritan, we can offer our own gratitude to God, rejoicing in praise and thanksgiving for the boundless, gracious love that heals and comforts and makes us whole.